this meeting to order. It's 1:15, and thank you all for coming today. If you'd all rise and watch the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Go ahead and take roll. Commissioner Talcott. Here. Commissioner Swenson is absent. Commissioner Trujillo. Here. Commissioner Petrovitz. Present. Commissioner Humble.
Here.
Commissioner Robinson. Here. Commissioner Warren's here. All right. We'll move right into the consent agenda. The consent agenda is made up of routine day-to-day items that require board attention but do not appear to have significant public impact. Items may be pulled from the consent agenda for separate discussion vote by any board member. On the consent agenda for today, we have approval of board minute meetings from 4/24 and a special meeting minutes of 5/22, which had to do with the airport bid. We also have payroll checks totaling $63,700.56. We also have maintenance and operation checks totaling $163,048.93. And we also have the financial reports for April, which were included in the board packets. The chair would entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion? Any discussion? All in favor of the consent agenda? Aye. Opposed? Consent agenda passes. We don't have it listed on the agenda today, but I think I know Commissioner Briggs is here from Cascade County Commission, and he has been very gracious to give us some time to report on the JLUIS meetings and study and that plan. So we're going to go ahead and put you on first, Joe, if you would, please.
Okay. I think as most of you know, Jeff Mangan represented the Airport Authority on the JLUIS effort, and he emailed me earlier this week, said that he was supposed to give a presentation to you today and he wasn't going to be able to attend. So I considered doing that by PowerPoint, but I thought better of it because I knew that John would have already started them anyway. So I just prepared a little briefing sheet. This is one of those things that I think most people in the community have some level of awareness of, but the specific details, sorry Robert, they're not sheets, I need a cheat sheet. This is just really an overview of what the JLUIS is and what we've been up to. To start with, the Joint Land Use Study is exactly what it sounds like. You take the jurisdictions in proximity to a military base, you study the land use issues of the base, the mission profiles, you overlay that with what the community needs and desires are, and you try to draw basically a blueprint and a toolbox for how do you coexist peacefully. How does the military keep from doing anything that disrupts the community any more than necessary? And what can the community do to keep from inadvertently goofing up the military mission in the future? Sounds simple. This is actually a pretty big thing. A few years ago, the DoD made this a priority for installations. And although we're in the first third of them that have been done, in probably the next decade, the rest of the bases will have JLUISs done as well. Now, typically a JLUIS is you take the base perimeter, do a map overlay, add 3,000 feet to it, and that's the area you study. Well, when we started this process with Malmstrom, we were working with the Office of Economic Adjustment, which for those of you who aren't familiar is a sub-department of the Department of Defense. They are the people who funded the regional economic diversification study that we're all using to try to diversify our economy when the 564th missile mission was shut down. That was basically what DoD gave us as a compensation, was this diversification study. So anyway, OEA was the funder of that. We have a good working relationship with them, so we started down this road with the JLUIS. First met with them, we did the 3,000 feet outside the fence, and sitting there looking at it, and I said, you know, I need to be able to include the roadways. And they said, well, what do you need the roadways for? I said, well, we're carrying nuclear weapons on the roadways. I would think that that's an important part of the JLUIS. And they went, oh, yeah. Better include the roads. So then we met with the guys at Malmstrom, and they said, well, you know, we don't really have any encroachment issues around Great Falls. That's not the problem. Our problem is what's happening out in Wheatland County. Windmills popping up. It's cell towers popping up. It's these kind of things that we don't know anything about. And so we called OEA again and said, geez, you know what? We missed the mark again. I need to expand this to be the missile field. They said, well, that makes sense. How big is that? I said, 23,800 square miles. Phone went dead. So anyway, but that's really the nature of this beast. The 564th is now being fully decommissioned, so it goes away, but we've still got almost 14,000 square miles that this JLUS covers. So there's 7 counties and the city of Great Falls. There's 8 jurisdictions that were involved in this planning effort, along with Malmstrom Air Force Base. And as I said, the idea is how do we make sure we don't make mistakes going forward? Much of the JLUS deals with how do we connect the planning departments together in a logical fashion so that Malmstrom even knows what's happening. And a lot of the recommendations of the JLUS are not regulatory in nature. They are simply communication. And I'm happy to say that although the document ink is not that dry yet, and it's a 292-page document with all kinds of stuff in it, a lot of the major elements have already been done because they're not regulatory. They're as simple as, when do we need to make sure the Air Force gets engaged? So we actually have a really good story to tell here in Cascade County, because one of the reasons when we first started the JLUS that popped up was there was a cell tower erected without the Air Force knowing. Now those of us who live in Great Falls all of our lives, or those who've been here at the time, we don't think a lot about the Air Force. At least, I mean, I don't go to bed every night worrying about the fact that there's missiles out there with nuclear-tipped warheads. They do worry about it a lot. So when they get an alert from one of those launch facilities, they load up a group of people into one of those choppers that looks like Rambo. I mean, these guys have got the bandoliers, the bullets, they got the heavy weapons. These are not people to be played with. And they try to fly a direct line from Malmstrom Air Force Base to that silo that's got the alarm, just in case it's really an alarm. Now, they've never really had an interior alert. There's never really been somebody inside the fence line. But every once in a while, the sensors say there is. So they load up these guys and they take off on a beeline. Literally, one of these choppers came popping over the ridge, and there's a cell tower they did not know was there because the county never notified them. It wasn't Cascade County, thank God. But the county never notified the Air Force that there was a cell tower being built. Luckily, the pilot was able to avoid the issue. But it kind of registered a red mark in everybody's mind. This is why we need to know what's going on. Now the counties have a system to notify Malmstrom when this kind of stuff happens. The other side of the coin, we had a windmill developer come to Great Falls, talk to the county commission. Now, historically, anything over 500 foot, as you guys probably all know because it's FAA regs, anything over 500 foot has to go through the FAA. The FAA doesn't know about missiles. They don't know about line-of-sight communication. All they do is stamp whether it looks like it's a problem for aviation or not. Developer comes, literally, conversation in my office, I said, have you talked to Malmstrom Air Force Base? So we don't have to, we've got FAA clearance. I said, no, trust me, you need to talk to Malmstrom. Well, they didn't want to. So basically we said, no, if you want the tax abatements from Cascade County, you go talk to Malmstrom. They did, and there was no height issue with Malmstrom, but one of the windmills would have blocked a microwave transmission signal connecting a missile site with the MAF. Not acceptable. If we had not found that out on the front end, that developer literally would have been millions of dollars into a project and then had to move towers. Instead, they sat down for 20 minutes, figured out where to move the tower with Malmstrom. There wasn't a problem. That's a success story. That's what the JLUS is supposed to do. It's supposed to head off that kind of stuff in advance. So we've actually become the model for how to handle windmill operations, because all of our counties are now requiring that any new wind towers that go in get vetted by Malmstrom. Vast majority of them, not a problem. But on those weird ones that might be a problem, so far everyone's been able to just be moved a little bit, and it has not represented a problem to the developer or a problem to the Air Force. And that's what we're trying to do. So that's the tone of the JLUS. That's what the thing is really about. We got the grant from OEA. We did a nationwide request for proposals from engineering firms, selected Matrix Design Group. As it turns out, they have done about 2/3 of the J-Luces that have been done in the U.S. total. And we worked with them for over 2 years because of the size of this project and working with all the jurisdictions. The result, which I'll leave a copy of with you guys, I think John's already got a copy, and it's also a set of the CDs with all the documents on it, is that study. Chapter 1 deals with what is a J-Luce. Chapter 2 gives a profile of all the communities, counties, and the base itself. Chapter 3 outlines potential places of conflict. And I use the word potential strongly because it identifies some things that some folks in the community have said, oh my God, you're trying to stop all development on the east side of town. Just points out the potential problems. The study has no regulatory authority whatsoever. Acceptance of the study by the city and the county have just meant that we have accepted it as a planning tool. Any actual changes in regulation will have to go through the full public process. In the case of the county, it would come through a zoning process. In the case of the city, depending upon exactly what it was, it would either come through as a city ordinance or their zoning process. That's the thing we've been beat up about the most, is that somehow magically this was a regulatory document. It's not. On the back, I've included a list of who was on the committees. You will note that there is no majority of any regulatory body on these committees. That was by design. That was so that there could not possibly be any basis for somebody to claim that it was a regulatory document. There was one Cascade County Commissioner on it, me. There was one city person on it, not a majority of anything. So like I said, I'll leave this, the rest of you in your hands, so you can just read it. I don't want to belabor the points too much. But it has been a very successful process. Where we are now is that each of the jurisdictions is looking at the document, deciding what, if anything, out of the recommendations, which is Chapter 4, they want to implement. And then they'll work through their own process to implement them. City of Great Falls hasn't decided exactly what they're going to do. And that's indicated in this. Cascade County, we've got our zoning map. We're starting that process now, going through our zoning regs. We've got a small number of issues that have come up since we did the zoning last in 2009 that we're already planning to deal with. And then the only thing on the J-Luce that's being added is what's called a military overlay district. Now this body is far more familiar with that concept than anybody else because it's exactly the same as the height district you have around the airport. Comes from the FAA, it deals with glide slopes, interior surfaces, the exterior surfaces, all the imaginary surfaces that involve an airport. Remarkably, in the whole time that Malmstrom Air Force Base's runway has been there, the county has never acknowledged the existence of those FAA surfaces. The military overlay district will do that, and it's height only. Now the other thing, like you know, just like at the airport, the slopes are such that most of the impact zone is on the airport proper. The same is out at Malmstrom. So it will not have a profound impact even on properties adjacent to Malmstrom. But that's kind of where the county is going. That's the element that we think is important. The other thing that's going on that is of note is when we were working through this program, we had a number of public meetings around the region. One of the things that kept coming up from wind developers is, how do we know where it's safe to develop, where we've got a problem? And Malmstrom kind of said the same thing. He said, you know, while we appreciate it, we don't want to have to look at every development that comes through. It would be nice to know if there was kind of preconditioned areas that we knew were okay, areas that needed more scrutiny, and areas that probably were not going to work. So the concept of a red, yellow, green map came up. And what that'll do is it'll take wind resource maps that we already have. It will overlay Malmstrom's installation information to the extent that they will give it to us. And we will create areas of a map that basically say, you're a wind developer, you go into the green area, you don't have to talk to Malmstrom, just go for it. If it's in the yellow area, you need to talk to Malmstrom. If it's in red, it'll be more difficult, not necessarily a no-go, but you're going to have to work harder with Malmstrom. And that seems to be the direction that all the jurisdictions want to go. So the next step from my standpoint is we are starting the process of applying for an implementation grant to OEA to fund the development of that red, yellow, green map. And that'll be a regional map. So that's the real quick spin of what this thing has been. And I've been working on it now for 4 years, if you go back to when we first got it nominated, started getting the funding and everything else. Like I said, John was involved in it. We appreciate him, once again, like I said earlier, we appreciate his involvement in this process. His understanding of airport imaginary surfaces was quite useful, as you might imagine. So if anybody has any questions, or do you want me to cover anything else?
Joe, a great presentation, by the way. That's a lot of material to, kind of overlay in 10, 12 minutes, so great job. Just a couple questions. What's been the general reaction to this from, say, the local developers in and around the Maelstrom area? And I think you know what I'm talking about. I'm begging the question here a little bit, but just curious how they viewed all this, the end result and kind of the process, and do they feel like they've been included, and maybe, can you comment on that a little bit?
We fundamentally have one landowner that, no matter what we did, in my opinion, was not going to be happy. Before we even started, he sent a letter to the OEA accusing them of stealing his land. So that just kind of started that laid out the starting process. Overall, I think it's been very good, like we have tended to do with the county. We bring the realtors in, we bring the home builders in. We try to get representatives to help us rework our stuff. Zoning's the same way. We're putting together, in addition to the planning board, which already has a good cross section, we're adding about 6 people to that, like from the realtors, from the home builders and contractors, to improve that pool to look at our regulations. So it was the same kind of a deal. I really think that for the most part, people are pretty comfortable with what's come out of it. There's a little bit of trepidation by landowners, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, anytime a jurisdiction starts looking at maybe making zoning changes, I have no problem with an owner, property owner having concern. The only thing about this that wasn't quite right is that the concerns that were expressed at the meetings were not based upon fact, because the JLUIS itself was simply a study. And the individual treated it as if it was a zoning hearing. And so that kind of turned off the other public members that were there who didn't quite understand why this guy was giving literally a 45-minute speech at all of these meetings. But I think overall it was pretty good public buy-in. Most of the community understands the part that it's important to protect Maelstrom, and really doesn't understand the details of the how or the why. And I think that's an unfortunate, normal part of the public process. Those people who have the most to lose are the only ones who really get engaged a lot of times. It did pass as accepted by the City Commission 5-0, and it was accepted by the County Commission 3-0. So I feel good about the public process. I said it was kind of a weird deal because it wasn't a formal meeting of any body, so it doesn't really follow public meeting rules, but we tried to follow public meeting rules anyway, just to try to make sure that everybody was engaged. It was kind of interesting, some of the questions we got, like in outlying areas, we got a number of people who had missile silos in their fields. They weren't concerned about the JLUIS at all. They wanted to talk about people not shutting their gates and the cows getting out. So it was an interesting process.
Any other questions for Commissioner Briggs?
If I could, I have to say, having read the study, the portion of the study that talks about the windmills and protecting the air corridors is a fantastic example of putting a process out there for collaborating low-level routes. And it's something that's not done well throughout the country, and something that's never been protected well, particularly out in those rural areas for people that are flying in visual conditions at night and those types of things. Because if you look at the windmill and you see the blinking light, there's still another 100 foot above that where the blade reaches. And I got to say, it's a great example. I wish the FAA would adopt some type of coordinated process like that, because this study really, I think, in trying to establish a process for that type of development, is doing a great service for Maelstrom, and it's a shame the general aviation community doesn't have something similar from the FAA's perspective. I think that portion of the study in particular is brilliantly done.
Anything else for Joe? Great job, Joe.
Okay, thank you, folks.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good presentation, Joe.
Okay, we'll move right to the director's report on the capital funding plan.
Yes, the capital funding plan, we haven't updated this in quite some time, but it's the two sheets that were passed around one's a sideways spreadsheet, kind of looks like this, and then behind that's our capital plan. As we mentioned in the last couple of months, the FAA has changed the funding requirements for their federal program. For about 10 years, we were under a temporary program that required a 5% match on the federal dollar, and now we're up to a 10% match, which is historically where the match always was, but we had that little 10-year hiatus there. So in conjunction with our budget this year, our financial budget, Sharon and I worked on putting together the sources and uses to update us to the new federal requirements, and then also to consider our new airline agreement that we signed last year. We built a new financial model with that, and this was our first opportunity to update an actual year, put in a budget year, and then run the new capital program through the same model in order to help us produce this cash flow. So what we've got here is what we call the sources and uses, and maybe the easiest thing is to pull these two pages apart. The portrait sheet is a 5-year capital program that we have to give to the FAA every year. This is our actual program as submitted to the FAA. This is what they have on record for us. And in fiscal year 2012, and these are federal fiscal years, I'll point that out too, so it's a September 1 fiscal year. In there, our big project for the year is the terminal project, which we're hoping to get our entitlements about $1.7 million on, and about $2.5 million in discretionary, as we've talked about in previous months. Finish there. Oh, I'm sorry, it's October 1, it's the federal fiscal year. So included in this sheet is all of our planned capital expenditures that the FAA has record of for the next 5 years. And we've also included in here some of our purchases, like the snow equipment. Next year, we plan to, in the next fiscal year, we plan to buy hopefully a broom, tow behind broom, and maybe a tractor and those types of things. So this is really all of our capital plan. And if you look at the column that says local funds other, that is our federal, that's our local match. That's what comes out of our reserve funds for each of these projects that we plan to implement. And you can see some of them are funded completely from our reserves, like the snow equipment purchase in fiscal year 2012. That was the front-loaded tractor, or front-loaded bulldozer, I guess is the best thing to call it, that we bought earlier this year. So what we've provided here, this is all of the other column there, is all the cash flows that go as a use of cash in the landscape chart that we've got here. And we've included all the local match for those projects in the planning so that you know that everything's in there. So shifting over to the sources and uses, again, what this document was intended to do is to take into account all of our capital needs, all of our cash flows, all of the projects we plan to implement in the next 4 or 5 years, along with all the sources of capital that come into us, and then forecast that forward so we can get down to a bottom line of where our reserve balance is likely to end up. And that's what we've got here in the chart. Starting with the uses of capital, that first line, local share of capital costs net of PFC reimbursements, that's all of these local funds that you see in this chart adjusted to our fiscal year. So the difference we have here is the portrait sheet is federal fiscal year. That's how we have to submit our planning to the federal government. Our landscape sheet is our financial planning, which is our fiscal year. And so there's some differences, like the terminal project, for example, which we intend to spend in the federal fiscal year, yet it'll be our next fiscal year. So you can see in here we've got, the first line is our local share of projects net of PFC reimbursement. This is what we literally have to come out of pocket for after we put our PFC funds towards the projects that we've planned to use PFCs for the next 4 or 5 years. You may recall we put an application in late last year that will pick up the majority of our share requirement on the noise program for the next 2 or 3 years. The next line down is our checkpoint project, We called that one out individually so you can see the actual amount of dollars that we plan to spend on that project in the uses of funds. So we spent about $400,000 last year on design. This current fiscal year on design. We anticipate we'll spend about $2.5 million on construction in the upcoming fiscal year starting in July. So that's the entirety of that project. Down below, we've got a loading bridge replacement program, which we've called out. We're intending to, we bought a loading bridge last year, as you know, at the end of the year, at the end of the calendar year. And then we plan to buy another one in 2014, assuming we don't buy it any sooner for the terminal project. We've budgeted in there to have some money available for another loading bridge for the gate that the new gate will be building. There's also potential that we may end up, if we decide long-term Alaska works well on that gate, the Salt Lake City Bridge may need replaced at some point in that time frame too. So we've got a $300,000 budget in there for a refurbished bridge in fiscal year 14. And then out in 2020, we plan to replace 2 of the bridges, getting us on more of a 10-year cycle. We've got the Minneapolis Bridge probably needing replaced about that time frame, as long as the bridge that Allegiant currently uses today. So we've just made some allowances in there for loading bridges, knowing that that's a large piece of capital that we'd have to replace from time to time. So then we have our totally local share anticipated. This is everything that we anticipate we have to fund out of our bottom line for the next few years. And you can see annually that number varies widely depending on how big the capital program is that we have ongoing at the time. We've got a big capital program next year, our biggest one in the forecast period, which will be the terminal project, nearly $3 million out, heading out that year for our program. And then it begins to taper off as we get a little bit further out. On the sources of capital, what we've got in here is our the various ways that we attain money for our capital needs. The first is the passenger facility charge revenue that comes into us, and the majority of that is used to pay off debt service currently on the old the terminal project, the ramp portion of the terminal project, which was built some number of years ago. I think it's probably 8 or 9 years ago now. And that debt service extends out until about 2016 or 17. As that debt service is paid back, our current plan would be to use the residual funds to begin to pay for almost all of the local share on the noise program, assuming we would go forward with the noise program. That is the primary source of local funds we would use to fund the noise program, so that we don't have to take it out of our local bank account funds. And so over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we anticipate all of our PFC revenue would go into funding local share of eligible capital projects. As the debt service begins to wane, we'll put more and more of that PFC program into the projects we have in the AIP program and the noise program in order to use those funds. So you're seeing we get about 465, and now with our new passenger volumes, that's going up substantially. The latest planning Sharon and I have been looking at is probably about 650,000 annual PFC dollars will be generated with the higher employment levels. That money will flow right back out into matching projects that we do in our capital program as a use of that fund. Approximate cash surplus from airline operations. We have a fairly detailed airline model, and what the airline model does, it's a little more complex than this, but more or less what it does, it adds up all of our expenses and nets out all of our revenues, and whatever residual is left is what the airlines have to pay us in revenue. That model goes on to forecast cash flows based on that, and based on our debt service requirements and those types of things, and it ends with a bottom line number, which is what we anticipate will be our flow through to the surplus fund, bottom fund after we fund our debt service, our operations, and everything else. That line comes directly from our airline model, and that's our anticipated contribution to reserves every year that would be available for capital program and those types of things. And you can see on average that's going to be about $1 million growing over time to a little bit more than that we have available as free cash flow we can use to do projects, or we can let it accumulate. In addition to that, the last line on there, we anticipate we'll continue to receive about $25,000 a year from the Energy West folks for their portion of the match on the RSIP program, should we choose to continue that program. So that's an external source that's not from our operations that comes in and adds to our sources of capital. So what we end up with is the next set of lines here is, okay, we have our sources, we have our uses. From time to time, we're going to have to borrow in order to add to our bottom line and make sure we have enough liquidity. We've set sort of an unofficial target of about $1.3, $1.5 million is what we want to keep as our bottom line minimum number in reserves. What we're showing in here in the next series of lines is our net financing and borrowing that we anticipate will happen in order to provide additional capital. Currently, we're not forecasting needing any additional borrowing in the forecast period for our capital program or for operating use needs. So you can see in there we don't have anything shown for new financing. So what we do at the bottom down there is we actually deduct out any future debt service which would come out of our bottom line again, assuming we add some capital in. There's going to be some accompanying expense and debt that we'd have to pay back, and we end up with our bottom projected reserve balance at the end of the year. And that's the bottom line in bold. So Sharon and I believe at the end of this year, after we pay a few more design bills, we'll probably end the year at around $3.9 million this fiscal year in the reserve account. Next year, we're going to spend a good portion of that. You can see up above in the total local share anticipated $3 million is needed. We only generate net about $1 million, so we're going to have a deduction from that bottom line figure to draw us down to $1.9 million that we'll have at the end of next fiscal year, and so on and so forth throughout the remainder of the program. So what this is intended to illustrate is, given the capital program we have here, assuming we get everything we ask for, which will never happen, but we can certainly ask and try, if we get all the federal dollars we anticipate, we can handle all of our capital program for the next 3 to 4 to 5 years with no borrowing, including the terminal project. There is one stipulation on that, as we presented in last month's meeting. We may need to float about $1.7 million requirement through the terminal project if we do not receive the discretionary grant in August, and we have to use our capital program, or have to use our AIP grants for next year. We'll need some type of bridge financing for about 9 months until those grant funds are being written in 2013. So there is a chance we may need a temporary borrowing facility, more of a banking product than a loan, for about 6, maybe 9 months until we can get to those dollars in 2013. But the bottom line is, it looks like we can maintain healthy bottom line figures, assuming we implement the capital program we currently have on hand, without additional borrowing over the foreseeable future.
So other than the short-term borrowing, which could happen, we talked about that, under no circumstances would we fall below the $1.8 million, which is the reserve cushion that you projected. At least there's nothing that would indicate that.
There's nothing that would indicate that. I mean, unforeseen events can happen.
Right.
We may get to next fall. We have a refinancing window opening up for, which project is this, Sharon? I always get it wrong.
It's the terminal.
It is the terminal ramp.
The terminal.
So the terminal ramp bonds that were sold a number of years ago are available for refinancing in September. They actually balloons out, actually. It's a required.
It's allowed, you're allowed to refinance.
Oh, we're allowed. Okay, so we don't have to, but we're allowed to. Presumably, we can lower our rate and lower our debt service, which would again release more of the PFCs that we could use for other projects. That's what we presume. So when we get to next September, and of course that financing will start probably about this time next year, we can take out a little bit of additional debt if we get through the terminal project and we decide, we'd really like to buy that extra loading bridge we talked about, or we're uncomfortable with the working capital, we'd like $500,000 more in the reserve account. We can add to that bond financing probably at no additional cost on debt service, because again, the rate's going to come down some, the overall debt service will come down some. We can probably feather in that a little additional debt and not impact our overall cost. So we have a window open next fall. If we decide the working capital is too tight, or we want something in addition to what we have, or something pops up that was unforeseen, we can borrow a little bit extra. We can actually put that on the terminal project as the asset being financed, and then get some additional debt. We're not forecasting the need for that, but we do have a great window open next September to do that if we like.
Are you asking for any action, or is this
No,
just
this is
strictly
something from
information?
time to time we present, and as we update it, and with the budget cycle this year, we wanted to give a fresh look at it. And certainly the environment has improved substantially over where we were a year ago.
Oh, definitely. Any questions?
Except that this is an extremely useful thing, at least for me, as a commissioner, this source and uses is, it just puts everything, you go from one thing to another, so it's kind of hard to keep track of when you got this. What's the overview? It's really nice.
Thank you. Very good. Any other questions, or JC?
Just a comment. Should we find it necessary to obtain the short-term financing? I think that hopefully we will find that the attitude of the bank that you presented to us earlier has changed. If it hasn't, then I would suggest we find a different bank.
I don't know how far down the road we've gone beyond what.
We've had some further discussions with them. I talked to Bob, I think it was US Bank, I think it was Thursday. And, yeah, and I told him, you know, the major objection we have to the financing tool that you've proposed is the holding cost on the unborrowed funds. You know, so I told him that, you know, you really need to work on that. And they're going to be revising that, that financial tool. We actually have that as a separate item on the agenda in the working session. Yeah, that is the primary concern that I voiced to him. The attorney's fees, that one, I don't know that we can avoid it because the problem is this debt has to be subordinated to the bonds. When the bonds were financed so many moons ago, we agreed to certain stipulations, one of which is any future borrowings have to be approved and properly documented in line with those bonds so that it's clear that they're subordinated. So, you know, unfortunately, we're going to have some legal fees associated with setting up any new financing, no matter what it is, or with who it would be. And that comes from the bondholder, the trustee is going to require that.
Well, even if they didn't require it, it's almost a necessity. You just got to make sure that that's one of the things that you have to get right.
It is, and you know, it probably wasn't in vogue back in those days, but typically when we did our financings for my clients, you would try to carve out a certain amount of borrowing working capital that the bondholders would pre-approve. It wasn't done in this deal, probably because we're a smaller airport. You know, the bigger airports have, for instance, they have a short-term borrowing program up to $30 million, and they just draw off of and repay through commercial paper. You know, it wasn't envisioned for us to have any credit underneath that, and so it wasn't allowed for in the documents. So they've got to go back in there, do some tuning up, and get it fixed.
Okay, very good. Any questions? Let's move to item number 1, airport improvement, change order number 2, EI 353.
This is back to the United Materials project out, what I've been calling the Southwest Drainage Pond. As you may recall, we ran into a utility line that had to be lowered. We've received an initial budget of about $20,000 from Northwest Energy. It's their line, so we have to pay them to move it. They came back and told us that that was not going to be sufficient. We needed another $20,000. The action we took over the, I'm sorry.
It was 10 the first time. 10
No, I'm sorry,
so it's
I got
20
to double it. Okay, so it was 10 the first time when they told us. We went ahead and we did approve last month a change order in the amount of about $10,000. It now appears that Northwest Energy needs $20,000, as we said last month, and so we need to take formal action to actually change order up to the $20,000 that they're going to charge us to lower that line. The lowering actually has been achieved now, and the project is nearly done. We just need the spending authority to actually complete the payment. So we're just asking.
It doesn't show any change in the total of the project.
Well, the total project, we're still under the initial spending
That's right.
of the non-project. The difference is we didn't plan on paying any of that money to Northwestern Energy.
Yeah.
So we didn't have spending authority for that vendor.
Yeah.
But we
But
will.
it's within the scope of the original budget.
Right, we're going to be able to maintain the original project budget. The main difference is we've got a new vendor added in. It exceeds my ability to sign off on it. So we have to bring it to the board to accept just accept Northwest Energy as a vendor.
Okay. The chair would entertain a motion on this.
The full 20,000 is being shown here, but we've already approved 10.
We had approved 10. That's a good question. So the motion should be.
So we're approving the
was
additional.
just on the work session last time, 420.
That's true.
It wasn't, it was gonna be 20, I just had to bring it to you.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Didn't change the law.
Any discussion?
We're discussing it. Hold your water.
Well, we'd like to be part of your discussion.
Well, I assume this is it, and they're not gonna come back wanting another 10 next month. I would hope not.
No, the project's almost done. We just have put like a head gate in that big culvert that goes under the runway, and that still needs to be done as part of this project.
That was a specialty piece that took us a number of months to order. It's basically a weir gate that, so we can shut it off for spill containment.
Just because it's almost done doesn't guarantee that you're going to try to charge them.
What's that?
I said, just because it's almost done doesn't mean you might not try to come back and charge
Oh,
them.
well, they'll make try, but
They may try.
I work with these guys all the time. I will refrain from any comment. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. All right. Trans-system storage contract. Director.
Yes, this is the on and off storage project we've had for a couple of months now with Trans Systems to store some man camp units on site. And I'll let Laura just provide the update to this.
And the map goes with this.
Yes, yes, and before, we had been looking at the triangle there right across from the jail. And that spot was going to, Trans Systems was going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to prepare that area to be able to store these modular trailers. So their client did not like that, and they were actually looking to go someplace else. So we gave them another option, and the reason we didn't give this to them right off the bat is because of the ingress and egress issues that you have having it out on the airfield.
Well, initially, we didn't realize they were going to harden the surface. When we first started talking, it was just going to be
Yeah, I
storage.
did a step
And
further.
as it evolved, they had planned to put gravel down to store these units on, which, I mean, that's a ton of gravel if it's 15 acres. so-
Grading, gravel, everything, and it was spending. So this is the area from this map, this is the area that we had moved over, the extra millings that we had for a possible aircraft storage. And to date, we haven't been able to utilize that, so this gives us an opportunity to use that. We'll have, as far as what we're looking at for the airport, we said that we do still have some extra millings. There's a few repairs in the road to make as far, and also widening the entrance so that it's an easier, they can get in and kind of angle in with their big trucks rather than having a hard corner there. So we figured, talking to Rod, our crew can do it, and it's around $500, so they'll just pay that up front. The lease would start on June 1st, and I have 3 years written there with 2 3-year options or year-to-year. Since I did this, I've heard back from Trans Systems, and what they would prefer to do is just go 1 year and then go basically year-to-year after that. So that would work for us. The only way the rates would change, we've got the 12 cents at an unimproved rate. And the only way that would be changing is if we were increasing our rates just the same as any other tenant. So the total there would be $45,600 at an annual rate that we'd be getting. And this is completely contingent on FAA approval. Rod and I talked with Gary last week, and we owe him some information, and they're going to have to do a review. They had reviewed when we were looking at putting the aircraft there as far as the tail heights and all of that. And so there will be barriers on either side as far as safety. They will have badged personnel here in Great Falls that will always have to escort the drivers. And so Gary seemed pretty happy with that, with having barriers and the escort and all of that. So we've got to work through that and make sure that they're good. But Trans Systems on the other side is, of course, wanting to go as soon as we can. So we wanted to bring this to you, get approval. Nothing would change as far as the amounts and the term, at this point, it would just be getting that approval from FAA and being able to pull the trigger as soon as we do.
I thought you said the term was gonna be 1 year instead of 3.
No, I'm saying as far, what I'm presenting today,
Okay.
nothing will change, we've got to get that FAA approval, but beyond that, everything will stay the same.
I've got some questions, but I'd like to put on a discussion of the motion. So, is there a motion on this item?
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay.
One more thing too, just to throw out, is that there is in the contract, which we had discussed before, a 90-day termination clause that they are good with. And that'll just say that if there is an aviation-related use that we need it for, we can terminate within 90 days. And the FAA was good with that too, in the other location.
So I have at least, well, I have two main questions. First question is, how would they bring those units in? Would they come around the perimeter highway over by FedEx and then?
Yes.
And then is there, would they go through that gate there that's locked? Is that how you do it, Rod?
Yeah, go right behind FedEx, and then you can kind of, it's real faint on this
That
picture.
little faint road from the perimeter road, is that
Yep.
where you?
Kind of comes into the middle of that section.
Okay, and then that's blocked off at each end, is that what the orange is?
That's the idea, we want to create some kind of barrier there, probably a jersey barrier with maybe like an S-turn in it or something that a truck can't navigate, just in case the truck gets, turned around. We want to create a closed system so they can't get out of there and end up, on a moving surface.
And then the other question I have is, these are pretty heavy, so is there going to be any potential for road damage bringing these units in?
No, I don't see any. We've had one or two of them in here, one, I guess. And we didn't have any problems with it. I don't see any problems on our perimeter road.
They come in once and they leave once, so it's not repetitive traffic. I wouldn't think, how many units do you think they can fit out there? Any idea?
Well, it's 1,900 long by 200 wide.
So if it's 200 wide, and those are what,
They're
20-foot
About
units?
60 feet.
60, yeah, okay. Yeah, so, certainly we're gonna have more truck traffic out there, but it's not a tremendous amount of in and out. They more or less come in once and then they leave once.
And they're just a trailer, and they just park the trailer there?
Yeah, they're on a trailer, and they actually pull them off the trailer. That's why they needed the ground hardened. We initially thought they would stay on trailers, and, more or less, the tires could have parked on bare earth. But they want to unload them down onto the ground. So the milling surface works well for that. The problem being that 15 acres is a lot of millings. So this piece of pavement not being in use made a lot of sense to us as a revenue proposal to make some additional funds.
And this is the local transit folks. Any other board questions? Okay. All in favor of the motion? Aye. Opposed? All right, actually passes. All right, very good. At this time, as we have mentioned before, we're going to conduct the formal evaluation for the director, and he has not waived his right to privacy, so we will close the board meeting at this time. And I don't anticipate this closure to last that long, so we have more, a couple of action items afterwards, so if you'd like to come back and join us, that would be great.